Responding to the widespread anti-denial protests, a Congress resolution of 10 July 1942 called for full compensation for any loss of landed property or boats, which it said should not be surrendered until compensation was settled. From London, the War Cabinet declared that the Congress denial resolution, moderate enough, amounted to treason. Amery urged Linlithgow to adopt harsher measures with regard to Gandhi and the Congress leadership rather than merely punish the wretched villager who refuses to hand over his boat or his bullock cart. Meanwhile, the poor were on the move by the millions, trudging through the monsoon rains, now half naked, falling by the wayside and dying, or struggling into urban areas to beg for food. What passed for a health system was in shambles, underorganized, understaffed, and lacking in basic supplies. Bengal's official Surgeon General would describe the famished as mere skin and bone, dehydrated, with dry, furred tongues, sores on lips, staring eyes. Viceroy Linlithgow, whose attitude towards the mass starvation had been to ignore it as far as possible, was replaced in October 1943 by Wavell, whose imperial cursus included the suppression of the Arab revolt in Palestine and humiliating defeat in Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. Prior to that, he had served in Kenya, Cyprus, and Somaliland. This was the itinerary of many officers in the imperial legions. Churchill had found him a disappointing military commander, i.e., Wavell had disagreed with him and sent him off to New Delhi to get him out of the way. Churchill regarded him as a good average colonel who would have made a good chairman of a Tory association. This was a bit unfair. Wavell was far too well read and cultured to be just that, and in fact, after touring Calcutta incognito with his wife, he instructed the military to help with relief, committing a full division to the effort. On Wavell's orders, the destitute refugees were gradually transferred to army camps from November 1943 onwards, and meager rations were allocated. However, the compulsory roundups in Kolkata, in an attempt to clear the city of begging skeletons, led to the separation of families and related social disasters. Husbands abandoned their wives, children were sold or left to die. Widows in joint family homes were discarded like unwanted rubbish. Mass prostitution flourished as isolated women and children were kidnapped and sold into brothels. By the end of 1943, well over 3 million Bengalis had died. Wavell acknowledged the famine and tried to do something about it, despite being regularly thwarted by London. He remained unpopular with his masters. Churchill asked in a mocking telegram why, if food was so scarce, had Gandhi not died yet. Wavell's star rose high at an early stage of the war. His friend Basil Liddell Hart later wrote, "The glow was the more brilliant because of the darkness of the sky." Churchill regarded him as too cautious, while Wavell thought Churchill's understanding of military tactics hadn't developed much since the Boer War. Churchill wanted his warlords to be more like himself, bullying, insensitive, and adventurous. Wavell was a bookish introvert. If there had ever been a proper commission of inquiry into the famine, he would have provided valuable evidence to counteract the inhumanity displayed by Churchill and Attlee in the War Cabinet. As the skies of Bengal darkened with the smoke of burnt bodies, Wavell did his best to convince London of the necessity for large scale imports of food grains, enlisting the support of the Commander in Chief of the Indian Army, Claude Auchinleck, and of the Chiefs of Staff in London. Wavell continued to request food through February and March 1944, going so far as to threaten his resignation. He exhausted every avenue, including the newly founded United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Authority, UNRWA, without success. To Churchill's outrage, Wavell approached Roosevelt directly, asking for U.S. ships to bring grain to a battered subcontinent beset by famine and hunger. Roosevelt, together with Congress and the U.S. media, remained indifferent. They did not wish to offend Churchill. Australia and Canada both offered aid, but there was no available shipping. In March 1944, the British government offered 400,000 tons of wheat in exchange for 150,000 tons of rice. In June, Wavell managed to extract 200,000 tons from the War Cabinet, but this was still too little in his eyes. Churchill then requested US aid himself in mid 1944, but shipping had been committed to the European conflict. The War Cabinet was unmoved, with Churchill observing that the starvation of the anyhow underfed Bengalis was less serious than that of the sturdy Greeks. Ooh. According to Emery, writing in his journal, Winston so dislikes India and all to do with it that he can see nothing but waste of shipping space. Wavell's intervention appeared to have stabilized the situation in Calcutta by the end of the year, but mass starvation continued in the countryside. As the winter drew on, the predicament of the rural poor was worsened by chronic cloth shortages, so that many died not only homeless and starving, but literally naked. For propaganda purposes, however, the famine was supposedly now under control. The War Cabinet still resisted Wavell's requests for food imports. The first half of 1944 saw an increase in the death rates as epidemics took hold on a weakened population. Deaths from malaria would peak that November. Another 2 million people died of hunger, disease, and exposure during 1944. In Calcutta, the urban poor lived on the absolute margins of life and death, in stark contrast with the increased profits that Indian industrialists were making. In December 1944, the new governor of Bengal, the Australian politician Richard Casey, recorded his horror at the living conditions he encountered on a tour of Calcutta's slums. Human beings cannot let other human beings exist under these conditions.